The BOGGART'S Glen. The manor of REEVE, it has been said, was skirted by a deep woody ravine of 3 or 4 miles in length, extending from the little village of Sabden in Pendle Forest to within a short distance of Orley. And through this gully flowed a stream which, taking its rise near Barley at the Pendle Hill, added its waters to those of the colder at a place called Cotbury. In summer or in dry seasons, this stream proceeded quietly enough and left the greater part of its stony bed unoccupied, but in winter or after continuous rain, it assumed all the character of a mountain torrent and swept everything before it. A narrow bridle road led through the ravine to Sabden, and along it, after quitting the park, the cavalcade proceeded, headed by Nicholas. This glen was in very ill repute and was never traversed, even at noonday, without apprehension. Its wild and savage aspect, its horrend precipices, its shaggy woods, its strangely shaped rocks, and tenebrous depths where every imperfectly seen object appeared doubly frightful, all combined to invest it with mystery and terror. No one willingly lingered here, but hurried on, afraid of the sounds of his own footsteps. No one dared gaze at the rock, lest he should see some hideous hobgoblin peering out of their fissures. No one glanced at the water, for fear some terrible kelpie with twining snakes for hair and scaly hide should issue from it and drag him down to devour him with shark-like teeth. Among the common folk, this part of the ravine was known as the BOGGART'S Glen and was supposed to be haunted by mischievous beings who made the unfortunate wanderer their sport. For the last half mile, the road had been so narrow and intricate in its windings that parties were obliged to proceed singly, but this did not prevent conversation, and Nicholas, throwing the bridle over Robin's neck, left the shore with the animal to assure his course unguided, while he himself, leaning back, chatted with Roger Norwell. At the entrance to the gloomy gorge above described, Robin came to a stand, and refusing to move at a jerk from his master, the latter raised himself and looked forward to see what could be the cause of stoppage. No impediment was visible, but the animal obstinately refused to go on, though urged both by word and spur. This stoppage necessarily delayed the rest of the cavalcade. Well aware of the ill reputation of the place, when Simon Sparshot and the grooms found that Robin would not go on, they declared he must see the Boggart and urged the squire to turn back, or some mischief would befall him. But Nicholas, though not without misgivings, but did not like to yield us, especially when urged on by Roger Norwell. Indeed, the party could not get out of the ravine without going back nearly a mile, whilst Sabden was only half that distance from them. What was to be done? Robin still continued obstinate, and for the first time paid no attention to his master's command. The poor animal was evidently a prey to violent terror, and snorted and reared, while his limbs were bathed in cold sweat. Dismounting and leaving him in charge of Roger Norwell, Nicholas walked on by himself to see if he could discover any cause for the horse's alarm, and he had not advanced far when his eye rested upon a blasted oak, forming a conspicuous object on a crag before him, on a scattered branch of which sat a raven. "Croak, croak, croak, accursed bird, it is thou who hast frightened my horse," cried Nicholas. "Would I had a crossbow or an arquebus to stop thy croaking." And as he picked up a stone to cast at the raven, a crashing noise was heard among the bushes high up on the rock, and the next moment a huge fragment dislodged from the cliff rolled down and would have crushed him if he had not nimbly avoided it. "Croak, croak, croak." Nicholas almost fancied hoarse laughter was mingled with the cries of the bird. The raven nodded its head and expanded its wings, and the squire, whose recent experience had prepared him for any wonder, fully expected to hear it speak, but only croaked loudly and exultingly, or if it laughed, the sound was like the creaking of rusty hinges. Nicholas did not like it at all, and he resolved to go back, but here he could do so. He was startled by a buffet on the ear, and turning angrily round to see who had dealt it, he could distinguish no one, but at the same moment received a second buffet on the other ear. The raven croaked merrily. "Would I could wring thy neck, cursed bird," cried the enraged squire. Scarcely was the vindictive wish uttered than a shower of blows fell upon him, and kicks from unseen feet were applied to his person. All the while the raven croaked merrily and flapped his big black wings. Infuriated by the attack, the squire hit right and left manfully, and dashed out his feet in every direction, but his blows and kicks only met the empty air, while those of his unseen antagonist told upon his own person with increased effect. The spectacles seemed to afford infinite amusement to the raven. The mischievous bird almost crowed with glee. There was no standing it any longer, so amid a perfect hurricane of blows and kicks, and with the infernal voice of the raven ringing in his ears, the squire took his heels. On reaching his companions, he found they had not fared much better than himself. The two grooms were belabouringly each other lustily, and Master Potts was exercising his hunting whip on the broad shoulders of Sparshot, who in return was making him acquainted with the taste of a stout ash plant. Assailed in the same manner as the squire, and naturally attributing the attack to their nearest neighbours, they waited for no explanation, but fell upon each other. Richard Ashton and Roger Norwell endeavoured to interfere and separate the combatants, and in doing so received some hard knocks for their plan, but in all their pacific efforts were fruitless until the squire appeared, and telling them they were merely the sport of hobgoblins, they desisted, but still blows fell heavily on them as before, proving the truth of Nicholas's assertion. Meanwhile the squire had mounted Robin. Finding the horse no longer exhibit the same reluctance to proceed, he dashed at full speed through the haunting glen, but even above the clatter of hoofs and the noise of the party galloping after him, he could hear the horse exulting croaking of the raven. As the gully expanded and the sun once more found its way through the trees and shone upon the river, Nicholas began to breathe more freely, but it was not until fairly out of the wood that he relaxed his speed. Not caring to enter into any explanation of the occurrence, he rode a little apart to avoid conversation, and as the others, who were still smarting from the blows they had received, were in no very good humour, a sullen silence prevailed throughout the party as they mounted a bare hillside in the direction of a few scattered huts constituting the village of Sabden. Blight seemed to have fallen upon the place. Roger Norwell, who had visited it a few months ago, could scarcely believe his eyes, so changed was his appearance. His inquiries as to the cause of his altered condition were everywhere met by the same answer. The poor people were all bewitched. Here a child was ill of a strange sickness, tossed and tumbled in his bed and contorted in its limbs so violently that its parents could scarcely hold it down. Another family was afflicted in a different manner, two of its number pinning away and losing strength daily, as if a prey to some consuming disease. In a third, another child was sick and vomiting pins, nails, and other extraordinary substances. Roger Norwell and Nicholas listened patiently to a detail of all these grievances and expressed strong sympathy for the sufferers, promising assistance and redress if possible. All the complainants taxed either Mother Demdike or Mother Chattox with afflicting them, and said they had incurred the anger of the two malevolent old witches by refusing to supply them with poultry, eggs, milk, butter, or other articles which they had demanded. Master Potts made ample notes of the strange relations and took down the name of every cottager. At length they arrived at the last cottage, and here a man with a very doleful countenance besought them to stop and listen to his tale. "What is the matter, friend?" demanded Roger Norwell, halting with the others. "Are you bewitched like your neighbours?" "True am I, your worship," replied the man, "and I hope you may be able to deliver me. Your mum knows that somehow I were unlucky enough last Yule to offend Mother Chattox, and ever since then all's gone wrong with me. The good wife can never be able to come without sticking a red hot poke into your churn, and last week when our brindle so borrowed and had 15 to the litter and fine, and of ever you seen sin on 'em dead. Sad walk, messers, the week before that to new deed, and the week before that to more. So that's all my stock gone. Was me, no prospers with me. My poor dame is beside herself, and the children seem possessed, and I tried every remedy, but without success, and I followed the old witch worm, plucked her hantle and thatched for her roof, sprinkled it with salt and water, burnt it and burned the S at the charge of the moon. So no use, masters. Then again I had get in a horseshoe, heated it red hot, quenched it in a brine, and nailed it to the threshold with 3 nails, heel upward, no more use nor to the other. Then I had to sawn water and put it in a bottle with 3 rusty nails, needles and pins, for I had found that the witch had sunk thereby. And lastly I had let myself blood when the moon were at full, and in position to the old high planet, and mingled it with salt, burnt it, I trivet in the hopes of afflicting her, but without avail, for I seed her 2 days ago, and she flouted me and scoffed at me. What mun I do, good masters, what mun I do? Have you offended anyone beside Mother Chattox, my poor fellow? Said Norwell. Mother Demdike, maybe, your worship, replied the man. You suspect Mother Demdike and Mother Chattox of bewitching you, said Potts, taking out his memorandum book and making a note in it. Your name, good fellow? Hombre, or Wills, or Benz, or Thomas, or Sabin, replied the man. Is that all? Asked Potts. What more would you have, said Richard? The description is sufficiently particular, scarcely precise enough, returned Potts. However it may do, he will help you in the matter. Good Humphrey, etc. You shall not be troubled with these pestilent witches much longer. The neighbourhood shall be cleared of them. I'm really glad to hear it, master, replied the man. You promise much, Master Potts, observed Richard. Not a job, a lot more than I am able to perform, replied the attorney. That remains to be seen, said Richard. If these old women are as powerful as represented, they will not be so readily defeated. There you are in error, Master Richard, replied Potts. The devil, whose vassals they are, will deliver them into our hand. Granting what you say to be correct, the devil must have little regard for his servants if he abandons them so easily, observed Richard dryly. What else can you expect from him, cried Potts. It is custom to ensnare his victims and then leave them to their fate. You are rather describing the course pursued by certain members of your own profession, Master Potts, said Richard. The devil behaves with great fairness to his clients. You are not going to defend him, I hope, sir, said the attorney. No, I only desire to give him his due, returned Richard. Ha ha ha, laughed Nicholas. You had better have done, Master Potts. You will never get better in the argument, but we must be moving, or we shall not get our business done before nightfall. As to you, Nums, he added to the poor man, we will not forget you. If anything can be done for your relief, rely upon it, it shall not be neglected. Aye, said Orwell, the matter shall be looked into, and speedily. And the witches brought to justice, said Potts. Comfort yourself with that, good Humphrey, etc. Aye, comfort yourself with that, observed Nicholas. Soon after they entered a wide dreary waste, forming the bottom of the valley, lying between the heights of Hadiham and Pendle Hill, and while wending their way across it, they heard a shout from the hillside. Presently afterward perceived a man mounted on a powerful black horse, galloping swiftly towards them. The party awaited his approach, and the stranger speedily came up. He was a small man, habited in a suit of rusty black, and bore a most extraordinary and marked resemblance to Master Potts. He had the same perky features and same parchment complexion, the same yellow forehead as the little attorney. So surprising was the likeness that Nicholas unconsciously looked round Potts and beheld him staring at the newcomer in angry wonder. The Reeve of the Forest. The surprise of the party was by no means diminished when the stranger spoke. His voice exactly resembled the sharp cracked tones of the attorney. I crave pardon for the freedom I have taken in stopping you, good masters, he said, doffing his cap and saluting them respectfully, but being aware of your errand, I am come to attend you on it. And who are you, fellow, who thus volunteer your services? Demanded Roger Norwell sharply. I am one of the Reeves of the Forest of Blackburnshire, worshipful sir, replied the stranger, and as such any presence at the intended perambulation of the boundaries of her property has been deemed necessary by Mistress Nutter, as I shall have to make a representation of the matter at the next court of Swainmoor. Indeed, exclaimed Norwell, but how knew you we were coming? Mistress Nutter sent me word last night, replied Reeve, that Master Nicholas Assheton and certain other gentlemen would come to Ruffley for the purpose of ascertaining the marks, meres, and boundaries of her property early this morning, and desired my attendance on the occasion. Accordingly, I stationed myself on yon high ground to look out for you, and have been on the watch for more than an hour. Humph, exclaimed Roger Norwell, and you live in the forest? I live at Barrowford, worshipful sir, replied the Reeve, but I have only lately come there, having succeeded Maurice Mottisfont over Reeve, who has been removed by the Master Forester to Rosendale, where I formerly dwelt. That may account for my not having seen you before, rejoined Norwell. You are well mounted, sire. I did not know the Master Forester allowed his men such horses as the one you ride. This horse does not belong to me, sir, replied the Reeve. It has been lent me by Mistress Nutter. Aha, I see how it is now, cried Norwell. You are suborned to give false testimony. Knave, I object to his attendance, Master Nicholas. Nay, I think you do the man injustice, said Squire. He speaks frankly and fairly enough, and seems to know his business. The worst that can be said against him is that he resembles somewhat too closely our legal little friend there. That, however, ought to be no objection to you, Master Norwell, but rather the contrary. Well, take the responsibility of the matter upon your own shoulders, said Norwell. If any ill comes of it, I shall blame you. Be it so, replied Squire. My shoulders are broad enough to bear the burthen. You may ride with us, Master Reeve. May I inquire your name, friend, said Potts, as the stranger fell back to the rear of the party. Thomas Potts, at your service, sir, replied the Reeve. What, Thomas Potts? Exclaimed the astonished attorney. That is my name, sir, replied the Reeve quietly. Why, zounds, exclaimed Nicholas, who overheard the reply. You do not mean to say your name is Thomas Potts? This is more wonderful still. You must be this gentleman's twin brother. The gentleman certainly seemed to resemble me very strongly, replied the Reeve, apparently surprised in his turn. Is he of these parts? No, I am not, returned Potts angrily. I am from London, where I reside in Chancery Lane and practice the law, though I likewise attend as clerk of court at the Assizes at Lancaster, where I may possibly one of these days have the pleasure of seeing you, my pretended namesake. Possibly, sir, said the Reeve with provoking calmness. I myself am from Chester, and like yourself was brought to the law, but I abandoned my profession, or rather it abandoned me, for I had few clients, so I took to an honester calling and became a forester, as you see. My father was a draper in the city I have mentioned, and dwelt in Watergate Street. His name was Peter Potts. Peter Potts, your father? Exclaimed the attorney, in the last state of astonishment. Why, he was mine, but I am his only son. Up to this moment I conceive myself an only son, said the Reeve, but it seems I was mistaken, since I find I have an older brother. Elder brother? Exclaimed Potts wrathfully. You are older than I am by 20 years, but it is all a fabrication. I deny the relationship entirely. You cannot make me other than the son of my father, said the Reeve with a smile. Well, Master Potts, interposed Nicholas, laughing, I see no reason why you should be ashamed of your brother. There is a strong family likeness between you, so old Peter Potts, the draper of Chester, was your father, eh? I was not aware of the circumstances before. But for this intrusive fellow, you would never have become aware of it, muttered the attorney. Give ear to me, Squire, he said, urging pulling closer to the other side, and speaking in a low tone. I do not like the fellow's looks at all. I'm surprised at that, rejoined the Squire, for he exactly resembles you. That is why I do not like him, said Potts. I believe him to be a wizard. You are no wizard, I think so, rejoined the Squire, and he rode on to join Roger Norwell, who was a little in advance. I will try him on the subject of witchcraft, but Potts, as you dwell in the forest, he said to the Reeve, you have no doubt seen those two terrible beings, mothers Demdike and Chattos. Frequently, replied the Reeve, but I would rather not talk about them in their own territories. You may judge of their power by the appearance of the village you have just quitted. The inhabitants of that unlucky place refuse them their customary tributes, and have therefore incurred their resentment. You will need meet other instances of the like kind before you have gone gone far. I am glad of it, for I want to collect as many cases as I can of witchcraft, observed Potts. They will be of little use to you, observed the Reeve. How so, inquired Potts? Because if the witches discover what you are about, as they will not fail to do, you will never leave the forest alive, returned the other. You think not, cried Potts. I am sure of it, replied the Reeve. I will not be deterred from the performance of my duties, said Potts. I defy the devil and all his works. You may have reason to repent your temerity, replied the Reeve, and anxious apparently to avoid further conversation on the subject, he drew rein for a moment and allowed the attorney to pass on. Notwithstanding his boasting, Master Potts was not without much secret misgiving, but his constitutional obstinacy made him determined to pursue his plans at any risk, and he comforted himself by recalling the opinion of his sovereign authority on such matters. Let me ponder over the exact words of our British Solomon, for I have his learned treatise by heart, and it is fortunate my memory serves me so well, for sagacious prince's dictum will fortify me in my resolution, which has been somewhat shaken by this fellow, whom I believe to be no better than he should be, for all he calls himself my father's son, and hath assumed my likeness, doubtless for some mischievous purpose. If the magistrates say the king be slothful towards witches, God is very able to make them instruments to waken and punish his sloth. No one can accuse me of slothfulness and want of zeal. My best exertions are being used against the accursed creatures, and now for the rest. But if on the contrary he be diligent in examining and punishing them, God will not permit their masters to trouble or hinder so good a work. Exactly what I have done. I am quite easy now, and shall go on fearlessly as before. I am one of the lawful lieutenants described by the king, and cannot be defrauded or deprived of my office. As these thoughts passed through the attorney's mind, a low derisive laugh sounded in his ears, and connecting it with a Reeve, he looked back and found the object of his suspicions gazing at him and chuckling maliciously. So friendishly malignant indeed was the gaze fixed on him. Potts was glad to turn his head away to avoid it. I am confirmed in my suspicions, he thought. He is evidently a wizard, if he be not. Again the mocking laugh sounded in his ears, but he did not venture to look round this time, being fearful of once more encountering the terrible gaze. Meanwhile the party have traversed the valley, and to avoid a dangerous morass stretching across its lower extremity and shorten the distance, for the ordinary road would have led them to much to the right, they began to climb one of the ridges of Pendle Hill, which lay between them and the vale they wished to gain. On attaining the top of this eminence, an extensive view on either side opened up them. Behind was the sterile valley they had just crossed, its black soil, hoary grass, and heathy waste, only enlivened at one end by patches of bright sulphur-coloured moss, which masked a treacherous quagmire lurking beneath it. Some of the cottages in Sabden were visible, and from the sad circumstances connected with them, and which oppressed the thoughts of the beholders, added to the dreary character of the prospect. Throughout this weird region, thinly peopled it is true, but still of great extent and apparently abandoned to the powers of darkness, only one edifice could be found where its inhabitants could meet prayer, and this was an ancient chapel at Goldshaw Booth, originally erected in the reign of Henry III, though subsequently in part rebuilt in 1544, and which, with its low grey tower peeping from out the trees, was just discernible. Two halls were in view, one of which, Sabden, was of considerable antiquity and gave its name to the village, and the other was Four Stones, a much more recently erected mansion, strikingly situated on an acclivity of Pendle Hill. In general, the upper parts of this mountain monarch of the waste were bare and heathy, while the heights overhanging Ogden and Barley were rocky, shelving, and precipitous, but the lower ridges were well covered with wood, and the thicket once forming part of the ancient forest ran far out into the plain near Goldshaw Booth. Numerous springs burst from the mountainside, and these collecting their forces formed a considerable stream, which under the name of Pendle Water flowed through the valley above described, and after many picturesque windings entered a rugged glen in which Roughly was situated, and swept past the foot of Mistress Nutter's residence. Descending the hill and passing through the thicket, the party came within a short distance of Goldshaw Booth, when they were met by a cowherd who, with looks of great alarm, told them that John Law, the pedlar, had fallen down in a fit in the clough, and would perish if they did not stay to help him. As the poor man in question was well known both to Nicholas and Roger Norwell, they immediately agreed to go to his assistance, and accompanied the cowherd along a by-road which led through the clough to the village. They had not gone far when they heard loud groans, and presently afterwards found the unfortunate pedlar lying on his back and writhing in agony. He was a large, powerfully built man of middle age, and had been in the full enjoyment of health and vigour, so that his sudden prostration was the more terrible. His face was greatly disfigured, the mouth and neck drawn awry, the left eye pulled down, and the whole power of the same side gone. "Why, John, this is a bad business," cried Nicholas. "You have had a paralytic stroke, I fear." Nah, squire," replied the sufferer, speaking with difficulty. "It's no natural ailment, it's witchcraft." "Witchcraft!" exclaimed Potts, who had come up and produced his memorandum book. "Another case, your name and description, friend?" "John Law, Count Pedlar," replied the man. "John Law of Colne, I suppose, Petty Chapman," said Potts, making an entry. "Now, John, my good man, be pleased to tell us by whom you have been bewitched. By Mother Demdike, groaned the man. Mother Demdike, ah? Exclaimed Potts. Good, very good. Now John, as to the cause of your quarrel with the old hag, I can scarcely recollect it. My head is so confused, Messer, replied the pedlar. Make an effort, John, persisted Potts. It is most desirable such a dreadful offender should not escape justice. Well, well, and try and tell it then, replied the pedlar. Your mun know I were crossing the hill Count roughly with my pack upon my shoulders when who should I meet but Mother Demdike, and who asked me to give her some skivers and pins, but as I looked what had it I refused. You had better do it, John, who said, or you'll rue it tomorrow meet. I laughed at her and trudged on, but when I looked back and see her shaking her skinny hand at me, I repented and thought I would go back and give her the choice of my wares. But my pride were too strong, and I walked on to Barley and Odden and slept at Bess of the booth, and woke this morning stout and strong, fully persuaded that old witch's wreck would come to naught. Alack day, I were out my reckoning, for scarcely had I reached this clue or my way to Sabden than I were seized with a sudden shock, for if a thunderbolt had hit me, and I lost the use of my lower limbs and the left side, and should have died most likely if it hadn't been for Ebel or Gems or Dans who spied me out and brought me help. Yours is a deplorable case indeed, John, said Richard, especially if it be the result of witchcraft. You do not surely doubt that it is so, Master Richard, cried Potts. I offer no opinion, replied the young man, but a paralytic stroke would produce the same effect. But instead of discussing the matter, the best thing we can do will be to transport the poor man to Bess of the booth, where he can be attended to. Tom and I can carry him there if Abel will take charge of his pack, said one of the grooms. That I win, replied the cowherd, unstrapping the box upon which the sufferer's head rested and placing it on his own shoulders. Meanwhile, the gate having been taken from its hinges by a spar shot and the reeve, the poor pedlar, who groaned deeply during the operation, was placed upon it by the men and borne towards the village, followed by the others leading their horses. Great consternation was occasioned in Goldshaw Booth by the entrance of the cavalcade, and still more when it became known that John Law, the pedlar, who was a favourite with all, had a frightful seizure. Old and young flocked forth to see him, and the former shook their heads while the latter were appalled at the hideous sight. Master Potts took care to tell them that the poor fellow was bewitched by Mother Demdike, but the information failed to produce the effect he anticipated, and served rather to repress than heighten their sympathy for the sufferer. The attorney concluded, and justly, that they were afraid of incurring the displeasure of the vindictive old hag by an open expression of interest in his fate. So strongly did this feeling operate that after bestowing a glance of commiseration at the pedlar, most of them returned without a word to their dwellings. On their way to the little hostel whither they were conveying the poor pedlar, the party passed the church, and the sexton, who was digging a grave in the yard, came forward to look at them, but on seeing John Law he seemed to understand what had happened and resumed his employment. A wide-spreading yew tree grew in this part of the churchyard, and near it stood a small cross rudely carved in granite, marking the spot where in the reign of Henry VI, Ralph Childerhow, 10th Abbot of Worley, held a meeting of the tenantry to check encroachments. Not far from this ancient cross, the sexton, a hale old man with a fresh complexion and silvery hair, was at work, and while the others went on, Master Potts paused to say a word to him. You have a funeral here today, I suppose, Master Sexton, he said. Yeah, replied the man gruffly. One of the villagers, inquired the attorney. No, he weren't Nat Goldshare, replied the sexton. Where then? Who was it? Observed Potts. The sexton seemed disinclined to answer, but at length said, Mary Baldwin, the miller's daughter of Roughly, a pretty lass, as pretty a lass as you've ever seen, master. Her were the apple of her father's eye, and I hasna had a dry ease sin, who died all a day we mun ago. Old and young lass, and protty Mary Baldwin went young enough. Poor lass, and he brushed the dew from his eyes with his brawny hand. Was her death sudden? Asked Potts. No, not so sudden, master, replied the sexton. Richard Baldwin had fair warning 6 months ago. Mary were tatten ill, and for her first he knowed how it would end. How so, friend? Asked Potts, whose curiosity began to be aroused. Because, replied the sexton, and he stopped suddenly short. She was bewitched, suggested Potts. The sexton nodded his head and began to ply his matter vigorously. By Mother Demdike, inquired Potts, taking out his memorandum book. The sexton again nodded his head, but spoke no word, and meeting some obstruction in the ground, took up his pick to remove it. Another case, muttered Potts, making an entry. Mary Baldwin, daughter of Richard Baldwin, of roughly aged. How old was she, sexton? 13, replied the man. Oh, do not ask me any more questions, master. The burying takes place in an hour, and I hanna half dig the grave. Your own name, master sexton? I have done, said Potts. Zachariah Worms, answered the man. Worms? Ha, an excellent name for a sexton, cried Potts. You provide food for your family, eh, Zachariah? Tut tut, rejoined the sexton testily. Go and mind your own business, man, and leave me to mind mine. Very well, Zachariah, replied Potts, and having obtained all he required, he proceeded to the little hostel, where, finding the rest of the party had dismounted, he consigned Flynn to a cowherd and entered the house. BESS'S of the booth, for so the little hostel at Goldshaw was called after its mistress. Bess Whitaker was far more comfortable and and commodious than its untending exterior seemed to warrant. Stouter and brighter ale was not to be drunk in Lancashire than Bess brewed, nor was better sherries or claret to be found, go where you would, than to her cellars. The traveller crossing those dreary wastes and riding from Burnley to Clitheroe or from Colne to Whalley, as the case might be, might well halt at BESS'S and be sure of a roast fowl for dinner, with the addition perhaps of some trout on Pendle waters, or if the season permitted, a heathcock or a pheasant, or if he tarried there for a night he was equally sure of a good supper and fair linen. It has already been mentioned that at this period it was the custom of all classes in the northern countries, men and women, to resort to the alehouses to drink, and the hostel at Goldshore was the general rendezvous of the neighbourhood. For those who could afford it, Bess would brew incomparable sack, but if the guest called for wine and she liked not his looks, she would flatly tell him her ale was good enough for him, and if it pleased him not, he should have nothing. Submission always followed in such cases, for there was no disputing with Bess. Neither would she permit the frequenters of the hostel to sit later than she chose, and would clear the house in a way equally characteristically and effectual. At a certain hour, and that by no means a late one, she would take down a large horsewhip which hung on a convenient peg in the principal room, and after bluntly ordering her guests to go home, if any resistance was offered, she would lay the whip across their shoulders and forcibly eject them from the premises. But as her determined character was well known, the violence was seldom necessary. In strength, Bess was a match for any man, and assistance from her cowards, for she was a farmer as well as hostess, was at hand if required. As will be surmised from the above, Bess was large and masculine looking, but well proportioned nevertheless, and possessed a certain coarse kind of beauty which in early years had inflamed Richard Baldwin, the miller of Roughly, who made overtures of marriage to her. These were favourably entertained, but a slight quarrel occurred between them. The lover, in her own phrase, got his jacket soundly dusted by her, and declared off taking to wife a more docile and light-handed maiden as the best. Though she had given this unmistakable proof of her ability to manage her husband, she did not receive a second offer, nor, as she had now attained the mature age of 40, did it seem likely she would ever receive one. Best of the Booth was an extremely clean and comfortable house. The floor, it is true, was of hard clay, and the windows little more than narrow slits with heavy stone frames, further darkened by minute diamond panes, but the benches were scrupulously clean, and so was a long oak table in the centre of the principal and only large room in the house. A roundabout fireplace occupied one end of the chamber, sheltered from the draught of the door by a dark oak screen, with a bench on the warm side of it, and here, or in the deep ingle nooks on winter nights, the neighbours would sit and chat by the blazing hearth, discussing pots of nappy ale, good and stale, as the old ballad hath it, and as persons of both sexes came thither, young as well as old, many a match was struck by Bess's cheery fireside. From the blackened rafters hung a goodly supply of hams, side of bacon and dry tongues, with a profusion of oat cakes in a bread plate, while in case this store should be exhausted, means of replenishment were at hand in the usual crammed meal chest standing in one corner. Altogether there was a look of abundance as well as of comfort about the place. Great was Bess's consternation when the poor pedlar, who had quitted her house little more than an hour ago, full of health and spirits, was brought back to it in such a deplorable condition, and when she saw him deposited at her door, notwithstanding her masculine character, she had some difficulty in repressing a scream. She did not, however, yield to the weakness, but seeing at once what was best to be done, caused him to be transported by the grooms to the chamber he had occupied overnight and laid upon the bed. Medical assistance was fortunately at hand, for it chanced that Master Soodle, the chirurgeon of Colne, was in the house at the time, having been brought to Goldshore by the great sickness that prevailed at Sabden and elsewhere in the neighbourhood. Soodle was immediately in attendance upon the sufferer and bled him cautiously, after which the poor man seemed easier, and Richard Ashton, taking the chirurgeon aside, asked his opinion of the case, and was told by Soodle that he did not think the pedlar's life in danger, but he doubted whether he would ever overcome the use of his limbs. "You do not attribute the attack to witchcraft, I suppose, Master Soodle," said Richard. "I do not like to deliver an opinion, sir," replied the chirurgeon. "It is impossible to decide when all the appearances are decidedly those of an ordinary attack of paralysis, but a sad case has recently come under my observation, as to which I can have no doubt. I mean, as to its being the result of witchcraft, but I will tell you more about it presently, for I must now return to my patient." It being agreed among the party to rest for an hour at the little hostel and partake of some refreshment, Nicholas went to look after the horses, while Roger Norwell and Richard remained in the room with the pedlar. Bess Whittaker owned an extensive farmyard provided with cow houses, stables and a large barn, and it was to the latter place that the two grooms paused to repair with spar shot and play a game at BOGGART'S on the clay floor. No one knew what had become of the REEVE, for on depositing the poor peddler at the door of the hostel, he had mounted his horse and ridden away. Having ordered some fried eggs and bacon, Nicholas wended his way to the stable, while Bess, assisted by a stout kitchen wench, busied herself in preparing the tea-tables, and it was at this juncture that Master Potts entered the house. Bess eyed him narrowly, and was by no means possessed by his looks, while the muddy condition of his habiliments did not tend to exalt him in her opinion. "You're yourself a warm man, I must say," she observed as the attorney seated himself on the bench beside her. "To be sure," rejoined Potts, "where should a man take himself at home if not at an inn? Those eggs and bacon look very tempting. I'll try some presently, and as soon as you've done with the frying pan, I'll have a pottle of sack." "No, you winna," replied Bess. "You'll get neither eggs, no bacon, no sack here, I can promise you. And what kettles mun serve your turn. Go to the barn with the other grooms and play at kettle pins or 9 holes with him, and I'd send you some ale." "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you, hostess," replied Potts, "and have no desire to play at kettle pins or 9 holes. But what does this bottle contain?" "Sherries," replied Bess. "Sherries?" echoed Potts, "and yet you say I can have no sack. Get me some sugar and eggs, and I'll show you how to brew the drink. I was taught the art by my friend Ben Johnson, Rare Ben." "Ah, set the bottle down," cried Bess angrily. "What do you mean, woman?" said Potts, staring at her in surprise. "I told you to fetch sugar and eggs, and now repeat the order. Sugar and half a dozen eggs at least." "And I repeat my order to you," cried Bess, "to set the bottle down, or Ias may ye." "Make me, ha ha, I like that," cried Potts. "Let me tell you, woman, I am not accustomed to be ordered in this way. I shall do no such thing. If you will not bring the eggs, I shall drink the wine, neat and unsophisticated." And he filled a flagon near him. "If you don't, you shan't pay dearly for it," said Bess, putting aside frying pan and taking down the horsewhip. "I dare say I shall," replied Potts merrily. "You hostesses generally do make one pay dearly. Very good sherry is this, I fear, the true nutty flavour. Now do go and fetch me some eggs, my good woman. You must have plenty with all the poultry I see in the farmyard, and then I'll teach you the whole art and mystery of brewing sack. I'll teach you to dispute my orders," cried Bess, and catching the attorney by the collar, she began to bellabore him, sounding with a whip. "Hello, ho, what's the meaning of this?" cried Potts, struggling to get free. "Assault and battery, ho. I assault and batter you, I and bash you too," replied Bess, continuing to lay on the whip. "Why zounds, this passes a joke," cried the attorney. "How desperately strong she is. I shall be murdered. Help, help, the woman must be a witch." "A witch? I'll teach you to call me few names," cried the enraged hostess, laying on with great fury. "Help, help," roared Potts. At this moment Nicholas returned from the stables, and seeing how matters stood, flew to the attorney's assistance. "Come, come, Bess," he cried, laying hold of her arm. "You've given him enough. What was Master Potts been on about? Not insulting you, I hope?" "No, I take care he didn't do that, squire," replied the hostess. "I told him he'd get naught but ale here, and he made free with a wine bottle, so he brought down the whip just to teach him manners." "You teach me, you ignorant and insolent hostess," cried Potts furiously. "Do you think I am to be taught manners by an overgrown Lancashire witch like you? I'll teach you what is to assault a gentleman. I'll prefer an instant complaint against you to my singular friend and client, Master Roger, who is in your house, and you'll soon find whom you got to deal with." "Marry him, yo," exclaimed Bess, "who can he? I took you for one of the groomsmen." "Fire and fury," exclaimed Potts, "this is intolerable. Master Norwell shall let you know who I am, woman." "Nay, I'll tell you, Bess," interposed Nicholas, laughing. "This little gentleman is a London lawyer who is going to roughly on business with Master Roger Norwell. Unluckily, he got pitched into a quagmire in REEVE Park, and that is the reason why his countenance and ailments have got bigger in." I thought he were a strange fettle," replied Bess, "and so he be a lawyer for Lunenhurst. Well," she added, laughing and displaying 2 ranges of very white teeth, "he'll remember Bess Whittaker the next time he comes to Pendle Forest." "And she'll remember me," said Potts. "No more so, mon," cried Bess, "or I'd rattle thy bones again." "No, you won't, woman," cried Potts, snatching up his horsewhip, which he had dropped in the previous assault, and brandishing it fiercely. "I dare you to touch me." Nicholas was obliged once more to interfere, and as he passed his arms round the hostess's waist, he thought a kiss might tend to bring matters to a peaceful issue, so he took on. "Ha, done with you, squire," cried Bess, who, however, did not look very seriously offended by the liberty. "By my faith, your lips are so sweet that I must have another," cried Nicholas. "I tell you what, Bess, you're the finest woman in Lancashire, and you owe it to the county to get married." "Why so?" said Bess. "Because it would be a pity to lose a breed," replied Nicholas. "What say you to Master Potts there? Will he suit you?" "Hep who? Do you think he'd put up with such possessment as he? No. When Bess Whittaker, the lonely day or gold shade, weds, it shan't be to a man and not to a ninny homer." "Bravely resolved, Bess," cried Nicholas. "You deserve another kiss for your spirit." "I done, I say," cried Bess, dealing him a gentle tap that sounded very much like a buffet. "See how yon jobbernaw is grinning at ye." "Jobbernaw and ninny hammer," cried Potts furiously. Really, woman, I cannot permit such names to be applied to me. Hush you please, for I see ye no better, replied the hostess. Come, Bess, a truce to this, observed Nicholas. The eggs and bacon are spoiling, and I'm dying with hunger. There, he added, clapping her on the shoulder. Set the dish before us, that's a good soul, a couple of plates, some oat cakes and butter, and we shall do. And while Bess attended to these requirements, he observed this sudden seizure of poor John Law is a bad business. Deed on it, squire, replied Bess. I was quite glad at seeing on him, lodgers on me. Well, it's scarcely an hour since he left here, looking as strong as earthy as yourself, but it's a casually uncertain life we lead, here today and gone tomorrow, as Parson Holden says. Wall a day. True, Bess, replied Squire, and the best plan therefore is to make the most passing moment. So brew us each a lusty potty of sack and fry us some more eggs and bacon. And while the hostess proceeded to prepare the sack pots, remarked to Nicholas, I have got another case of witchcraft, Squire. Mary Baldwin, the miller's daughter of Roughly. Indeed, exclaimed Nicholas. What is the poor girl bewitched? Bewitched to death, that's all, said Potts. Aye, poor Mira, who's to be buried here this morning, observed Bess, emptying the bottle of sherries into a pot and placing the latter on the fire. And do you think she was forspoken, said Nicholas, addressing her. Folks say so, replied Bess, but I'd leave her howl to my tongue about it. Then I suppose you pay tribute to Mother Chattox, hostess, cried Potts. Butter, eggs and milk from the farm, ale and wine from the cellar, with a flitch of bacon now and then, nay, be thy maskins. I get her no, cried Bess. Then you bribe Mother Demdike, and that comes to the same thing, said Potts. Well, you know so far from it, Mark's time, replied Bess, adding eggs, sugar, and spice to the now boiling wine, and stirring up the compound. I wonder where your brother, the Reeve of the Forest, can be, Master Potts, observed Nicholas. I did not see either him or his horse at the stables. Perhaps the arch impostor has taken himself off altogether, said Potts, and if so, I shall be sorry, for I have not done with him. The sack was now set before them and pronounced excellent, and while they were engaged in discussing it, together with a fresh supply of eggs and bacon fried by the kitchen wench, Roger Norwell came out of the inner room accompanied by Richard and the charger. Well, Master Pseudo, how goes on your patient? Inquired Nicholas of the latter. Much more favourably than I expected, Squire, replied the chirurgeon. He will be better left alone for a while, and as I shall not quit the village till evening, I shall be able to look well at him. You think the attack occasioned by witchcraft? Of course, sir, said Potts. The poor fellow affirms it to be so, but I can give no opinion, replied Pseudo evasively. You must make up your mind as to the matter, for I think it right to tell you your evidence will be required, said Potts. Perhaps you may have seen poor Mary Baldwin, the miller's daughter of Roughly, and can speak more positively as to her case. I can, sir, replied the chirurgeon, seating himself beside Potts, while Roger Norwell and Richard placed themselves on the opposite side of the table. This is the case I referred to a short time ago when answering your inquiries on the same subject, Master Richard, and a most afflicting one it is, but you shall have the particulars. 6 months ago, Mary Baldwin was as lovely and blooming a lass as could be seen. The joy of her widowed father's heart, a hot-headed, obstinate man, is Richard Baldwin, and he was unwise enough to incur the displeasure of Mother Demdike by favouring her rival, old Chattox, to whom he gave flour and meal, while he refused the same tribute to the other. First time Mother Demdike was dismissed without the customary dole, one of his milestones broke, and instead of taking this as a warning, he became more obstinate. He came a second time, and he sent her away with curses. Then all his flour grew damp and musty, and no one would buy it. Still he remained obstinate, and when she appeared again, he would have laid hands upon her, but she raised her staff, and the blows fell short. I have given thee 2 warnings, Richard, she said, and thou hast paid no heed to them. Now I will make thee smart, lad, in right earnest. That which thou lovest best thou shalt lose. Upon this, bethinking him that the dearest thing he had in the world was his daughter Mary, and afraid of harm happening to her, Richard would fain have made up his quarrel and the old witch, but it had now gone too far, and she would not listen to him, but uttering some words with which the name of the girl was mingled, shook her staff at the house and departed. The next day, poor Mary was taken ill, and her father, in despair, applied to old Chattox, who promised him help and did her best. I make no doubt, for she would have willingly thwarted her rival and robbed her of her prey, but the latter was too strong for her, and the hapless victim got daily worse and worse. Her blooming cheek grew white and hollow, her dark eyes glistened with unnatural lustre, and she was seen no more on the banks of Pendle water. Before this, my aid had been called in by the afflicted father, and I did all I could, but I knew she would die, and I told him so. The information I feared had killed him, for he fell down like a stone, and I repented having spoken. However, he recovered and made a last appeal to Mother Demdike, but the unrelenting hag derided him and cursed him, telling him if he brought her all his milk contained, and added to that all his substance, she would not spare his child. He returned heartbroken, and never quitted the poor girl's bedside till she breathed her last. Poor Rutshot, Rob's only daughter, and no wife to cheer him. I pity him from the bottom of my heart, said Bess, whose tears had flowed freely during the narration. He is well nigh crazed with grief, said the chirurgeon. I hope he will commit no rash act. Expressions of deep commiseration for the untimely death of the miller's daughter had been uttered by all the party, and they were talking over the strange circumstances attending it when they were roused by the trampling of horses' feet at the door, and the moment after a middle-aged man, clad in deep mourning but put on in a manner that betrayed the disorder of his mind, entered the house. His looks were wild and frenzied, his cheeks haggard, and he rushed into the room so abruptly that he did not at first observe the company assembled. "Why, Richard Baldwin, is that you?" cried the chirurgeon. "What, is that your father?" exclaimed Potts, taking out his memorandum book. "I must pay to interrogate him." "Sit thee down, Richard, sit thee down, man," said Bess, taking his hand kindly and leading him to a bench. "Can't I get thee anything?" "No, no, Bess," replied the miller. "I have lost, I availed, I this what, and I care now how soon I quit it myself." "Nay, dunna talk on this, Richard," said Bess in a sense of sincere sympathy. "I winna live to see happier and brighter days. I winna live to be revenged, Bess," cried the miller, rising suddenly and stamping his foot on the ground. "That accursed witch has robbed me of my heart's chief treasure, who has crushed the poor innocent of never injured her afore died, and has struck the heaviest blow that could be dealt me. But by the heaven above us, I win, requite her. Our father's deep and lasting curse leap on her guilty head, and on those of all her accursed race. Now rest me no day when I know tell I brought them to the stake." Right, my good friend, an excellent resolution. Bring them to the stake," cried Potts, but his enthusiasm was suddenly checked by observing the reeve of the forest peeping from behind the wainscot and earnestly regarding the miller, and he called the attention of the latter to him. Richard Baldwin mechanically followed the expressive gestures of the attorney, but he saw no one, for the reeve had disappeared. The incident passed unnoticed by the others, who had been too deeply moved by Paul Baldwin's outburst to really pay attention to it. After a little while, Bess Whittaker succeeded in prevailing upon the miller to sit down, and when he became more composed, he told her that the funeral procession, consisting of some of his neighbours who had undertaken to attend his ill-fated daughter to her last home, was coming from roughly Goldshore, but that unable to bear them company, he had ridden on by himself. It appeared also from his muttered threats that he had meditated some wild project of vengeance against Mother Demdike, which he intended to put into execution before the day was over. But Master Potts endeavoured to dissuade him from this course, assuring him that the most certain and efficacious mode of revenge he could adopt would be through the medium of the law, and that he would give him the best advice and assistance in the matter. While they were talking thus, the bell began to toll, and every stroke seemed to vibrate through the heart of the afflicted father, who was at last so overpowered by grief that the hostess deemed it expedient to lead him into an inner room where he might indulge his sorrow unobserved. Without awaiting the issue of this painful scene, Richard, who was much affected by it, went forth, and taking his horse from the stable with the intention of riding on slowly before the others, led the animal towards the churchyard. When within a short distance of the great old fabric, he paused. The bell continued to toll mournfully, and deepened the melancholy hue of his thoughts. The sad tale he had heard held possession of his mind, and while he pitied poor Mary Baldwin, began to entertain apprehensions that Alison might meet a similar fate. So many strange circumstances had taken place during the morning's ride. He had listened to so many dismal relations that, coupled with the dark and mysterious events of the previous night, he was quite bewildered and felt oppressed as if by a hideous nightmare which it was impossible to shake off. He thought of Mother Demdike and Chattock. Could these dreading be permitted to exercise such baneful influence over mankind? With all the apparent proofs of their power he had received, he still strove to doubt and to persuade himself that the various cases of witchcraft described to him were only held to be such by the timid and the credulous. Full of these meditations, he tied his horse to a tree and entered the churchyard, and while pursuing a path shaded by a row of young lime trees leading to the porch, he perceived at a little distance from him near the cross erected by Abbot Cladderhow two persons who attracted his attention. One was the sexton, who was now deep in the grave, and the other an old woman with her back towards him. Neither had remarked his approach, and influenced by an unaccountable feeling of curiosity, he stood still to watch their proceedings. Presently the sexton, who was shoveling out the mould, paused in his task, and the old woman, in a hoarse voice which seemed familiar to the listener, said, "What hast thou found, Zachariah?" "That which your lack, mother," replied the sexton. "Mazzard with her teeth thin. Pluck out 8 and give them me," replied the hag, and as the sexton complied with her injunction, she added, "Now I must have 3 scalps." "Here they be, mother," replied Zachariah, covering a heap of mould with his spade. 2 brain pans bleached like snow, and the bird with more hooer on it than I had or my own sconce. For its size and shape I should take it to be a female. I lay these 3 skulls aside for ye. What done you mean to do with them?" "Question me not, Zachariah," said the hag sternly. "Now give me some pieces of the mouldering coffin, and fill this box with the dust of the cold horse it contained. The sexton complied with her request. "Now you are getting off your seat, mother," he said. "I would pray you to take your departure for bearing for when be here presently." "I'm going," replied I, "but first I must have my funeral rites formed." "Ha ha, bury this for me, Zachariah," she said, giving him a small clay figure. "Bury it deep, and as it moulders away, may it represent pine and wither till she comes to the grave likewise." "And what doth it represent, mother?" asked the sexton, regarding the image with curiosity. "I do not know the face." "How should you know it, fool, since you have never seen her in whose likeness it is made?" replied I. "She is connected with a race I hate." "With the Demdikes?" inquired sexton. "Aye," replied I, "with the Demdikes. She passes for one of them, but she is not of them. Nevertheless, I hate her as though she were." "You do not mean Alison Device?" said the sexton. "I ha heard say who be very comely and kind-hearted, and I should be sorry only harm befell her." Mary Baldwin, who was soon lying there, was quite as comely and kind-hearted as Alison, cried I, "and yet Mother Demdike had no pity on her." "And that's true," replied the sexton. We'll do the bidding." "Hold!" exclaimed Richard, stepping forward. "I will not suffer this abomination to be practised." "Who is it speaks to me?" cried I, turning round and disclosing the hideous countenance of Mother Chattox. "The voice is that of Richard Atherton." "It is Richard Atherton who speaks," cried the young man, "and I command you to desist from the wickedness." "Give me that clay image," he cried, snatching it from the sexton and trampling it to dust beneath his feet. "Thus I destroy thy impious handiwork and defeat thy evil intentions." "Ah, I think thou wast so, lad," rejoined Mother Chattox. "Thou wilt find thyself mistaken. My curse hath already alighted upon thee, and it shall work. Thou lovest Alison, I know it, but she shall never be thine. Now go thy ways." "I will go," replied Richard, "but you shall come with me, old woman." "Dare you lay hands on me?" screamed the hag. "Nay, let her be, mister," interposed the sexton. "You had better. You are as bad as she is," said Richard, "and deserve equal punishment. You escaped yesterday at Whalley, old woman, but you shall not escape me now." "Be not too sure of that," cried the hag, disabling him for the moment by a severe blow on the arm from her staff, and shuffling off with an agility which could scarcely have been expected from her. She passed through a gate near her and disappeared behind a high wall. Richard would have followed, but he was detained by the sexton, who besought him, as he valued his life, not to interfere, and when at last he broke away from the old man, he could see nothing of her, and only heard a sound of horses' feet in the distance. Either his eyes deceived him, or at a turn in the woody lane skirting the church, he descried the reeve of the forest galloping off with the old woman behind him. This lane led towards Roughly, and without a moment's hesitation, Richard flew to the spot where he had left his horse, and mounting him, rode swiftly along.